But I grew up in Ireland, you know what I mean, and where it was, you know, statues walked and stuff, you know what I mean, and there seemed to be more dead around than living, really. When I was a kid, it was a depopulated country, you know what I mean, full of ghosts and stuff, you know, so maybe that affected me in some way. I don't think you ever really grow up, you know, that's one thing I do believe. When you write something or when you imagine something, you know, you often imagine it almost straight out of your childhood. Now, there was a bar in Dublin I used to go into when I was about 12, 14, and everyone was so friendly to me there. I thought, this is the nicest bar in the world, you know. You know, everyone's smiling, sit down here. Of course, I didn't realize. I gradually realized it was all men, you know. It's like, okay. I was always writing, you know, from when I was very young, and I published a book of stories around 1974, which, you know, was quite well regarded and won a few prizes at the time.
Neil stayed with me in London, and we got to know each other quite well, and I read his wonderful collection of fiction, which had just recently won, at that time in the early 80s, the Guardian prize for best first work.
And I knew Neil as a short story writer and a novelist. I didn't know he was going to make a film.
I made my first movie, Angel, in about 1982, and there hadn't been a feature film made here for about 20, 30 years.
And he told me he was going to do this film, and did I want to be in it? And I said, yeah. So it was much simpler in those times.
The first film that Stephen distributed was Angel, called Danny Boy in the States. It was the film that he set up his distribution company Palace with.
I asked Neil what else he was working on, and he gave me a script which subsequently became The Crying Game. At that point it was simply called The Soldier's Story or The Soldier's Wife. Then a movie called Cow was made with very similar kind of themes, and so Neil abandoned trying to finish this script, and we took up another project, Company of Wolves.
Company of Wolves was quite a commercial success all around Europe, you know, not so much in America.
We then went on to make a little film called Mona Lisa.
And Mona Lisa was quite a big success. Bob got nominated for Academy Awards and all that sort of stuff, you know. And I mean, I had never anticipated this kind of thing, you know. European directors had a hard time every time they went to Hollywood. It was like being caught in a meat grinder, basically, you know. And every director, I mean, if you remember, Antonioni went there and had a hard. Wim Wenders went there, had a hard time. Werner Herzog, you know, it's kind of an endless process, really, of the European sensibility, you know, meeting the machine. And that's was my experience. It's been many directors' experiences, you know. I mean, I made 2 movies there that were considered not to be successful, but I mean, I still enjoyed making them.
So Neil had really come off of We're No Angels and High Spirits, feeling not that pleased with Hollywood.
You know, I mean, I didn't enjoy making High Spirits because it was interfered with and the cut was taken from my hands, you know what I mean? But with We're No Angels, I was a director for hire, you know, and I think both the 3 temperaments involved, myself and Robert De Niro and Sean Penn, and David Mamet, actually, were a bit too dark for the kind of comedy the studio thought they were getting, you know.
So then Neil came back to Europe and wanted to make a smaller film. We'd always discussed The Miracle.
I just write something that's quite personal, so I wrote The Miracle, and it was based on the short stories I'd written in my 20s, you know, and I made that film, and nobody went to see it, so I was kind of unemployable.
The Miracle could be one of Neil's most critically well-received films. Didn't work. It was a flop, and coupled with The Big Man being a flop, those 2 films began a sort of downward spiral for my own company. And Neil said, "Do you remember the story?" This must have been 2 a.m. or something. Do you remember the story? Soldier's Story, Soldier's Wife. And I said, yeah, I remember it well.
The plot basically was a man who has been responsible in some way for the death of a black soldier that he's kidnapped, yeah. And he goes to contact his wife out of feelings of guilt, you know, an attempt to make things somehow understandable to him, and maybe to see is she all right kind of thing, you know, the kind of thing.
And when we were making Mona Lisa, we discovered a transvestite bar called Madame Jojo's, which we used to go to occasionally, and always sit there and just not believe that these incredibly beautiful looking women were men.
And I thought, if I make this woman a man, it'll become a different kind of story, and it will go into the areas that I want to go into.
And he said, well, what if when he comes back it's a man? Like those guys in Madame Jojo's.
I wanted to make a movie that started with realities of a specific political situation, you know, and then to bring it into territory that will even question the basis of those politics, you know. So when I made that character Dill, the wife of the black soldier who was killed, when I made her into a man, the whole balance of the story changed, you know, and it became very exciting.
And when he gave me the completed script, I just loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I just thought it was really wonderful work and magical and very funny and really exciting.
I had a very strong feeling, actually. It was very simple. I thought, okay, I've written a script. It's profoundly interesting to me, you know. It's got something kind of universal in it in a way. You know what I mean? It starts with realities of Irish life, but goes beyond that into something quite different. And I thought, if nobody makes this, you know, I just return to fiction, you know, because it's I didn't really want to work in an industry where it wasn't possible, you know, to make a statement as interesting, I thought, as that was, you know.
There's so much in that script. It's such a beautiful piece of work. And I kind of felt also for Neil that this is what he should be doing, that it was right. This is exactly right for Neil. When I got to Cannes and the script had gone out to all these people that I thought would love the film, and all the Americans were in Cannes, nobody liked it. I mean, quite the reverse. They hated it. I mean, they literally hated it to the point where they made me feel like I was some sleazy squirt trying to steal their wallets, you know. It wasn't just like go to a meeting about the soldier's wife, as it was then known, and to find out whether they liked it or not, but they would push the script across the table at you as if they had just been contaminated with something.
I mean, I certainly think on paper, the reason why no American company wanted to invest in the script, invest in the project beforehand, which is usual, was because of the subject matter. It was taboo.
The first time that I recall reading a Crying Game, which was not a first draft script, was on a trip from Madrid to Paris, and it was so fantastic that I had decided I was going to meet a French company called CB, and I was just really going for a make contact type meeting. I wasn't punting any pictures to them, but I actually did to them my first ever pitch of the Crying Game, which was really rather delicious because, you know, I started out saying, you know, it's set in Northern Ireland, and the French guy said, that is a negative. And then I went in and I said, well, it involves this black English soldier. I said, that is another negative. And then I said, you know, our hero is a member of the IRA. And he went, that is yet another negative. But I kept on going because, you know, I'm a trier. And he kept on saying, and then he falls in love with the black soldier's ex-partner. And he says, that is another negative. And he kept on going through this negative. And then I got to the end of the pitch and he said, but I love it.
Nick Powell and Steve Woolley were very keen to bring Miramax in up front. They felt that would close the financing and give them a good US distribution partner. And Bob and Harvey Weinstein were deeply concerned about the casting of the film. There was a real issue about the role that Jaye Davidson ends up playing because, of course, she is a she and then ends up being a he, which is a very, very difficult piece of casting to pull off. And I think Bob and Harvey didn't believe that Neil and Stephen were going to pull it off, and they were reticent to come in up front.
and I needed to get their money. I mean, it had to be there. I could see what the future was. The future was making the film without any American money, and we've been very spoiled up until then with Miramax. They've been good to us.
It was very, very tough on Nick and Steve at a point that they really needed this film to go into production, and Miramax had no interest in coming in up front.
And so I was somewhat upset and surprised that Miramax weren't going to come into the Crying Game.
I think it was so difficult to finance because, I mean, of the political, the racial, the sexual themes, but more importantly because I couldn't get arrested. You know what I mean? I think that was the real reason. It was hard to finance.
Film 4, the filmmaking arm of Channel 4, had been very keen on considering investing in the Crying Game, but they had taken a long, long time to make a final decision of putting up money.
Channel 4 had some problems, I believe, with the nature of the film itself. They felt that Jaye Davidson's character, Dill, should have been revealed from the outset as a transvestite. They felt it was very gimmicky to reveal her as a him in this way halfway through the film.
The big hang-up was over the ending. And Jack, who was the number 2 guy on the creative side at Channel 4, was delegated by David Orkind, the head of Channel 4, before they would put the money in, to sort out the ending. So the plan we came up with was that we would send Jack to Dublin, where Neil would take him to a pub, and they would stay in that pub until they had a resolution to the ending, and therefore Jack could say it's okay to put the money in.
We'd managed to get Channel 4 in. We then managed to get some money from British Screen, who were very nervous about our credit rating because they knew that Palace was going down, so that was very hard because they felt that it might be sucked in with the rest of Palace. And then we had to get the rest of the money from a little bunch of people called Euro trustees.
So myself and Stephen had put together a European distribution company of 5 independent distributors, from us in the UK, Senator in Germany, back in France, Gomez in Spain, another company in Italy.
We loved each other. We just would, and of course we got no work done. We just to go out drinking and eating, and telling jokes and having the best fun, and
And we had our first meeting in Venice to organise the company and decide what was the first film we were going to buy. And Steve was really only interested in the last item on the agenda, which was any other business, which was our whole purpose of forming the company, was to get them to finance the Crying Game, or part of it. And they did. They had all read it, they loved it, they're all big supporters of Neil, and they all came in, but they didn't have enough cash.
It was a jigsaw. It was a mess. It was a whole smorgasbord of different financing entities who all had to be happy with each other.
And we had gone to see Michio Yoshizaki, who was the European representative of Nippon Herald in Japan, and who had monies to invest, who had been a big supporter and admirer of Neil Jordan's. But I remember Steve famously saying to me, "It's a complete waste of time going to see Michio. You know, she's lost so much money on all these past Neil films that she'll never come round," and so on and so forth. But I said, "Steve, don't worry about it. I'm going to go down there and try, in a way, to prove him wrong." And, by the 3rd glass of champagne that Michio was paying for in the bar of the Excelsior in Venice, I had persuaded her to come into the film and to stick in that last piece of money.
By the time Stephen had tried to get them to finally commit to a screenplay and finally commit to the cast and the whole package, Stephen Woolley's credit cards had gone up to many, many thousands of pounds in his commitment to paying pre-production costs to get the movie going. There was an old joke that Steve would start and everyone else would catch up.
I had a gun to my head over making the film this year, so it had to start in November, and I had no way of funding the film. So the only way I could think of funding was for Film 4 to trust us and put some money up whilst the lawyers were sorting out the deals.
So Steve wrote a volley of letters with enormous impassioned phrases again and again and again. He would roll them off every kind of other day.
So there's a famous letter, famous amongst us, not in the world at large, a famous letter that Stephen Woolley wrote to Channel 4, which began, "Dear Colin, short of turning myself into a human funeral pyre in the reception of Channel 4, how do I get you to put money into this picture?"
And that passion, as Jack Leshner told me when I interviewed him, is insurpassable. There's no other producer who, once he's got the bit between his teeth, or she, will go to the wall in the manner that Stephen Woolley did.
So yeah, I did really give Channel 4 a very hard time, and I really did threaten to set fire to myself in the lobby, which was slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I think they felt that it might happen.
I just decided I wasn't going to do any more theatre. I was going to do film, and the only thing to do was to just turn down theatre until someone offered me a film. And about 3 weeks later, I met Stephen Woolley in a pub in London, and he said, "I've got a script for you," and it was The Crying Game. So, how lucky can you be, you know?
Neil met with Forest Whitaker, and Neil loved Forest, so we both agreed that we would, if we could, make allowances for the fact that Forest is American, but cast him in our film.
The casting of Forest Whitaker was to appeal to an American audience, to get an American name actor, and he's a lovely actor, and he obviously would have suited Neil, not just for his vision of this character, but also because of his other roles in Birds, for example.
But anyhow, we did get a lot of flack from certain quarters when we cast Forest, but I needed Forest for the film.
The film was picketed by one of the actors' unions for the casting of a black American actor as opposed to a black British actor.
I can never work out Brits who think you can't cast Americans in films when it's okay for Brits to be Americans in American films. Does anybody ever say, Anthony Hopkins is Welsh in America? I mean, do they ever say that? No.
Other people were very critical of the way he looked, that he didn't look like a soldier, he wasn't fit, he was overweight and round and soft, which I do actually think works for the character, but whether or not it looks like a soldier, I don't know.
We knew that the part of Dill would not be an actor.
I had to find somebody for that role that nobody knew. I mean, if I'd cast Wesley Snipes, for example, and don't laugh, you know, but or if I'd cast Prince, you know, or Michael Jackson, just a series of choices. Okay, everybody would say, "Oh, that's Prince in a dress," or "That's Wesley Snipes," you know, with lipstick. Whereas it had to be somebody that they didn't know, you know, so I had to find an unknown.
They even apparently asked Kathy Tyson to try out for the role, although I've also heard that apparently this was only to present a model.
We were looking for somebody who was a transvestite male, okay? So we had to go to all the clubs in London, you know. I had to send Susie Figgis, the casting director, around every possible club in England, you know. I tested and tested and tested, and eventually found Jaye. Jaye was the only person who could possibly even have approached the part, even in terms of the physical illusion of being a convincing woman, you know.
So that I wouldn't lose Stephen Rea and Forest Whitaker and the actors, and I wouldn't lose the crew, and I wouldn't lose Neil, I had to set a start date and start moving towards the start date. So we set the start date. We shot 3 days in Ireland. We were incredibly blessed because in the script it was supposed to be sort of summerish, and we got 3 sunny days, which was amazing. Film finances wouldn't guarantee those days, which meant that I didn't have a completion bond, which meant that if anything had gone wrong in those days, I had no insurance, no money insurance.
To shoot certain scenes out in Ireland, which were not bonded, was really putting Palace Pictures itself at risk. However, the film was finally bonded. It was just that Stephen wanted to get on with it.
But I had to keep going, so I would go to my cinema, and I owned my own repertory cinema in London, the Scala Cinema, where Palace originated from, the video side, and just take the day's takings.
Stephen Woolley called me up and said, we need the box office takings because we're shooting a film and the entire cast and crew is going to walk off set unless we give them some money.
You know, it was that hand to mouth. It was that hand to mouth.
So I said, yes, boss, and gave him the money from the tills. And that was it. He owned the cinema, he took the money.
So everything was being dribbled. And I was just dribbling £100 here, £20 there, just to keep it going. It was just barely keeping our nose above water.
Stephen Woolley was running around getting cash to pay people from the video outlet for Palace and everything. It was really, really crazy, you know. Crazy.
Oh, it was actually extraordinarily fraught because there was so little money to make the film with, you know, and actually there was, you know, it dealt with some quite large elements, you know, that were quite expensive, when the glass house is shot to pieces and various sequences of violence.
And, you know, what was daring about Neil, you know, was there wasn't time, but he made them take the time to get the big shots because they were big emotional shots. And I could feel Neil really, really expanding as a director at that time, you know.
You know, it was a film that demanded some, not, I don't think the word is style, but it demanded a certain kind of grace in the camera, you know what I mean? So it had to be made very, very carefully.
It has to go like clockwork. Things have to move efficiently and well. And so one finds oneself, you know, being eaten away with stress every day.
People were literally physically fighting behind me in the set as I was looking through the camera and directing a scene, you know, and they'd be doing it in silence, you know, everyone trying to get their space and stuff like that.
He described the underfinanced filming of The Crying Game as being like working in a war zone, and as I'm sure filmmakers know, it can be very hard working in underfinanced and under-resourced situations.
Well, I think during the whole process of the dialogue we had with Film 4 as regard to the script, Neil came up with what we always called the Some Like It Hot ending, because there was a sort of walking off into the distance between his character and the character of Dill. And we recreated a shopping street in the East End of London, complete with fake snow.
And we came up to shoot this scene, and I said to the producer, Stephen Rea, I said, look, this is not going to be in the film. You realise this? We shouldn't even shoot it because we're so strapped for cash, you know. And he says, well, we have to, you know, that's why they're back to it. I said, I guarantee you it's not going to be in the finished film. And it was an enormous setup. We had to close off a street in London with a Luma crane and lay down snow and shoot this kind of rather fake reconciliatory ending, which everybody, particularly the actors, because the actors always sense things, you know, knew would not be in the finished film.
It's freezing. You're not going to ask me where I've been? No. Fancy taking a trip?
Where, honey?
Told you not to call me that.
Where, Jimmy?
It's not Jimmy, it's Clive. Say where, Clive.
Where, Clive?
South of Spain, Florida, Barbados.
Is Clive going to give me grief the way Jimmy did?
Well, you don't know how it is, though. Nobody's perfect.
When we shot it, clearly did not work, and one has to give a lot of credit to Channel 4 in particular, and to British Screen, run by Simon Perry in those days, because despite the fact they had insisted on this very twee ending where they're like in a shopping mall and buying tickets to fly off to Rio together, very different from the existing prison ending, and gave the money to Neil to shoot the ending that he had originally written. So the film as it stands is not like a new ending was shot, it's actually the original ending which wasn't shot was then shot.
Palace was in serious trouble.
Well, we were in dire straits.
The company was being dismantled, you know, in order to, bits of it were being sold off to keep it alive, to keep people hired, you know, to keep people employed.
And we were very overstretched. We were shooting 3 pictures at once, and Crying Game was the 3rd picture. We were shooting 3 pictures at once, and you know, the creditors were knocking extremely loudly on the door, well, more than that, they were breaking the door down, taking bits of furniture and photocopiers and stuff.
The story I've heard is that Elizabeth Carlson, Steve Woolley's wife and a producer in her own right, carried the film in one arm. Actually, it's impossible to carry a 35mm feature film in tins in one arm, and unless you're Superman, and their newborn baby in the other to Paris to show Gilles Jacob, the director of the Cannes Film Festival, the film.
Yeah, I was very proud of the film and believed in it.
I think there was very much a sense that this was make or break for Neil, both in a personal sense and in a professional sense as well. I think he'd said that if the Crying Game wasn't a success as a film, then he would go back to being a writer.
So we showed him The Crying Game, and I suspected the first rejection was because I couldn't understand it. I think, yes, we then subtitled it, showed them, and they rejected it again. And that was a terrible blow.
This must have been very hard at the time because it's a very important launch pad culturally, critically and commercially for films.
It was a great shame that Palace Pictures Distribution was not actually handling the release of The Crying Game itself.
As part of the collapse of the organisation, some rights were bought by another company, the distribution outlet of which was called Mayfair.
So you had a set of executives who didn't have their heart and minds behind the film in terms of distribution at Mayfield. I'm sure they did try to do their best, but there was no question that they were nervous about the film. They weren't confident.
The ads and the posters were a bit of a mishmash. They could have been like a sort of wannabe James Bond film with a drawing of Stephen Rea holding a gun with Dill dancing in a pose with Miranda Richardson. It's just a bit of a mess.
The Crying Game's release in the UK was quite troubled. For a start, anything with the IRA or Irish politics tends to arouse a certain level of criticism that normal British films don't get.
It was a coincidence that the release of the film coincided with a particularly horrific IRA terrorist attack.
There was a bombing in, I think, North London of a pub, which was blamed on the IRA, so there was a lot of anti-IRA press at the same time.
It turned the press off the film. People didn't really want to see a sympathetic portrayal, I think, of an IRA terrorist at this time.
Including a certain gentleman who's now deceased called Alexander Walker, the chief critic of the Evening Standard, who completely lambasted the film.
They weren't keen on the fact that an IRA man could be seen to have a conscience or could have had a conscience to be disturbed by what was happening. So they didn't really take to that.
The same kind of lethargy and the same ignorance as to judging a book by its cover existed in the media.
And as soon as the critics gave it a good kicking, it pretty much died a death.
Miramax weren't affected by this at all. They were very solidly into it. Once Bob had seen the film, Bob Weinstein, Harvey's brother, Bob really believed in it. I mean, over and above Harvey. And Harvey really trusted Bob's tastes in terms of what is populist or what could go wide.
This was such an interesting love affair anyway, and so well told, that Harvey, I think, believed in the story.
Bob could see the exploitation value of The Crying Game. Harvey could see that it was a good movie.
The toughness and the hardness that Nick and Stephen experienced was equalised by Harvey's absolute passion to find an audience for this film.
The first American review and the first trade review, which was not only a wonderful review but also specifically said, do not under any circumstances tell people what the twist is in the movie. That reverberated across all of the journalists in America. Nobody revealed it.
I think the way that Miramax turned the nature of the film around for its marketing was brilliant. They came up with a very sexy campaign, a lovely image of Miranda Richardson, very film noir, with a smoking gun. And the most brilliant thing they did was encourage an entire audience to buy into the hook of keeping a secret.
The gimmick worked. But the good movies survive a gimmick. You see, the gimmick got people in, got people talking, but they would never have talked about it if the film itself hadn't worked.
It was like wildfire.
I mean, I saw the film once in New York with a packed house. The film had been running for 6, 7, 8 weeks. It was ridiculous.
I mean, you can't imagine what it was like. There'd be movie theaters where there'd be 3 screens, and the Crying Game would be on all screens.
This woman did it, and oh my God, standing in her seat. She was cheerleading the surprise. She was turning with this look of like, how could my girlfriends have kept this from me? How can my friends not have told me this? How was this a secret? And you could see it's pure pleasure because she was just so blown away.
There was certainly almost a kind of interactive element to the campaign that Miramax achieved.
People got blown away to the point where they secretly decided they weren't going to tell their friends.
See, because in America they didn't care about the politics, the Irish politics. They cared about the sexual politics a great deal. Like, Americans really just went for the sex in their quaint old-fashioned way, you know.
Because it's only in America, really, that these extraordinary kind of turnaround events can happen. They don't happen in Britain.
I mean, I'm walking down into Washington Square Park and there's a gay pride rally and they all start chanting my name. Stephen Rea! Stephen Rea!
It's only in America it became this phenomenon, you know.
That's the wonderful thing of if a movie hits in America, you know. They let you know. You know, if it hits in England, they say, oh, quite good.
We heard the news in the offices here, and Bob Weinstein was on the phone saying, okay, they're coming up now, and he's reading it off the TV, and he was saying, oh my God, best supporting actor, Jaye, you know, then a big cheer in the office, and best actor, Stephen, and then best screenplay, Neil, and best film.
But we were in a ironic, if you like, situation in that we were in Los Angeles, you know, with 6 nominations going to the Oscars, but I couldn't pay the hotel bill. Fortunately, Harvey did. He was very generous. He not only paid the hotel bill, but he paid the extras, which was really sweet of him. And so my son had a ball because once he found out that we weren't paying for the extras, we were getting pizzas and ice cream every 45 minutes.
I defy anyone to be curmudgeonly or to be mean-spirited about the effect that the Academy Awards have on you if you actually are a film fan.
I think the Academy Awards are hilarious because everybody lies through their teeth, you know.
And it wasn't about winning. It was about having those nominations. For me, I think for Neil it may have been different.
Everybody says, oh, it's not a competition, you know, and it's all about, I mean, they're wonderful films, there's so-and-so's movie, there's so-and-so, it shouldn't, the competitive aspect is horrible to say that, and you know they would cut people's throats to get that bloody statuette, you know, so it's hilarious, you know.
People say, you know, they see in that little box, that I look so happy.
You mean, I won for a writer, you see, I won the Academy Award for a script, and that's like, it's like a kind of a also round prize. It's like a consolation prize, you know. We're not going to give you director, but we give you and it's also the one they always give to independent movies, you know.
It was a great night.
Well, I didn't. You see, I thought maybe Jaye would win, you know. That's what I thought, or maybe I didn't know what I thought. Really, it was delightful.
I think what Harvey achieved with his release of The Crying Game was not only using the Oscars very well and the nominations and the underdog kind of campaign of the little film that comes from nowhere, which I think he achieved a great deal with, but I think he also tapped into the fact that audiences everywhere are more liberal and more interested than we might think in challenging stories, well-told stories, not necessarily stories about our own community immediately around us, but universal stories that can travel.
It was definitely part of the Clinton thing, I think part of America, an older generation in America having to face the fact that there was change ahead and that they would have to be part of that change.
No, there have been bigger movies since. At the time, and for a long time after, it was the biggest grossing movie.
Miramax at that point, having picked up The Crying Game and run with it, managed to entice Disney to take a real financial interest in their future. I think if the Crying Game hadn't succeeded, Miramax would have found it very difficult to survive.
Of course it transformed my life. I had a career in America, which I never had before, and I had a career in film, which I never had before.
Well, it's not so much the movie changed my life. It's the fact of that you can make a movie like that and people will go to see it. You know, that made me say to myself, it is worthwhile keep making movies, continuing to make films. Yeah.
Well, I was actually serving 8 years in prison. I had been charged with conspiracy to murder and kidnapping and IRA membership. So some of the charges were dropped, so I ended up getting 8 years anyway for involvement in the kidnapping of a police informer. And I was in the H blocks of Long Kesh, where 10 men had died in hunger strike in 1981, and where over 37 people had escaped from in 1983. It was a jail that held most of the IRA prisoners in the north of Ireland, and we were allowed out, stay out for an hour and a half at lunchtime, a couple of days a week whenever a feature film was shown. And so it was after the Crying Game, perhaps 94, 95, was released on video in Ireland.
I mean, everybody was saying you have to see this film because there's an incredible surprise in the middle of it, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. And so I suppose that was the big thing. Would the surprise affect me in the same way as it affected others?
What was funny was that prior to the character of Dill being revealed as being a man, there was a number of prisoners who hadn't had sex for maybe 10, 12 years, had really fallen in love with he, she, and so whenever that was revealed, it was a great moment for 2 or 3 of us who knew the real story and had a real laugh at the expense of some of the prisoners.
The story essentially is that the IRA has one of its key members being interrogated in Castlereagh. People were only held in Castlereagh. It was a legal interrogation centre. You know, you could only be held there for 7 days. Every member of the IRA has been interrogated in Castlereagh, and you're out after 7 days. So the idea that you would set up the kidnapping of a soldier and give them 3 days to release a guy. Okay, you've what 2 days to plan the kidnapping, a day to get the message to them, and then 3 days to deadline to release him. He's due out tomorrow anyway, you know.
You see them when they go on the operation in London to execute the High Court judge. None of them are wearing any disguise at all. I mean, not even differently. So there's all these things that, you know, I would carp at as a realist.
Didn't knock, honey.
Dill, who we've never heard of, we've no mention before of his or her history of being associated with weapons, is able to pull out the gun, and what a marksman she turns out to be. She plugs Miranda Richardson, you know, in the neck, in the chest, in the stomach. When you've been involved in a struggle, all these things set out like big sore thumbs that, you know, you just couldn't get away with. But I understand, because I'm a writer myself, that, you know, there is poetic license. You have to take shortcuts. You have to make assumptions that the audience will suspend their disbelief and go along with.
With regard to Stephen Rea's character, Fergus, he is going through a really deep set of, process of soul searching into what he actually is and why he's doing what he's doing. And the worst thing of all he's confronted is when he's told to kill Jody, you know what I mean? Which basically, makes him question his everything about himself.
I don't know, it's so subtle, you see. Fergus hardly feels himself changing. He's being seduced by Jody. Jody has to seduce him to try and save his own life. So he just slowly does so. Until Fergus is just in there. Fergus becomes a human being again. He relates to the guy not as a soldier, but as a human being. The most seductive thing that Jody says to Fergus is, "You're a kind man. That's your nature." And he suddenly sees, oh Jesus, I'm not the person I think I am.
What he's saying is, I think, I have seen something in you, Fergus, that you haven't even seen in yourself yet, you know. and that will come out, even if you think it won't. You will try to repress it, but you're in trouble, boy.
I think that the dilemmas that both the soldier and Fergus find themselves in are very realistic, where the soldier has to really use his intelligence and his intellect to try and scheme for a scenario where if the opportunity arises, he is going to try and escape or else turn Fergus. And Fergus is right material for being turned, because it's obvious that Fergus has his doubts.
When I was making the film, you know, I suppose I must have been responding to something that was in the air. There was a lot of questioning within, say even within the IRA at the time, you know what I mean? There was a lot of questioning of their procedures, of what they were doing. They've been involving, the Republican movement had been happily using death basically as a weapon to achieve a political end. And
the problem that I have with the film is that why isn't there a film made which portrays the IRA person as being flawed, of course, but and in their struggle with the British, still emerging at the other end, you know, with their humanity intact. Two main IRA characters in it, who I think is Maguire and Jude, the woman. I mean, they are depicted really as psychopaths, and that annoyed us. You know, it's kill at all costs.
I mean, come off it. You know, their job was to bring bombs down here into town and blow up buildings. Their job is to carry explosives and weapons over to London and blow up buildings. The job is to take people aside, talk to them nicely, and then shoot them in the back of the head. You know, I don't think you have to be pretty multidimensional for that.
All of the IRA characters get killed. They are all fanatics. And to me, that is what's unreal.
I mean, the job of an IRA operator killing somebody was to blot out all emotional feelings and all distractions from that. That has been described. That has been described by friends of Danny's. You know, that has been described by people that he knows very well. Kevin Toulis has written a book called Rebel Hearts in the IRA, where they describe how you go about, where Bobby Story, an IRA man, describes how you go about taking over somebody's house, you know. And you don't go in and you say, look, we are the army of the people, you know, you have to do us this little favour and let us use your house for an operation. You go in and you say, you sit there and shut up. I've got a gun and I'm the boss.
The only time that we as IRA prisoners recognised individuals with these characteristics is on film or in novels, because they aren't the people that we know.
The IRA was an organisation which functioned for 25 years in Belfast, killed 2,000 people, you know, and they weren't nice people.
The IRA is about freedom. It's about getting the British out of our country who have no right to be here. You know, it would be like us going to North America and making a film about the War of Independence. And just imagine that we reverse the roles there, and that the people who are psychopathic, the people who end up getting killed in the end, are two people who are fighting for American independence, and the person who is the hero is the one who goes over to the British side. Well, people would say, hold on a minute, that doesn't fit in with our history or in with, you know, our image of ourselves.
There is a mythology that within the system itself, that it's this great noble people's army, which is a lot of nonsense.
And the cause to me is a legitimate cause and a noble cause.
And I suppose I was asking myself, can this entire confluence of dialect or dialogue that's going on, can all these issues of argument and kind of arguments about identity and about politics and about political kind of histories and about identity of who we are as Irish people, as white or black or Protestant or Catholic, you know, can that entire kind of conversation go somewhere else, you know what I mean?
He's not entering into the question of whether the IRA is fighting a just war, but he is saying that you soldiers in this war that you believe is a just war have hardened yourselves, and you're denying yourselves your own experience, and you're denying yourselves your own personal human potential and development. That's what he's saying.
The fact is, the movie really, to me, is an important movie because it says, you know, change is possible. There are ways to see the situation there are worlds outside this situation.
You know, other people had tried this idea of looking at the Republican culture, looking at the Irish violence and saying, and counterposing it with other ideas of a peaceful society that operated normally, and saying, why can't you realize that you could live a nice life like somebody in Los Angeles or New York, you know? And what they did in this film was very, very different, much more radical and much more interesting, which is to say, I'll show you how limited your life is. I'll show you how limited your experience is. I'll take you to somewhere that you haven't even thought about.
And the characters in the movie survive because they change, because they accept change. And so I believe it had quite a even subliminal influence in changing how things are being dealt with in the North.
By and large, of course, the situation is vastly improved. We're much better off now as a result of the peace process.
I think the campaign of the IRA is over now. And I think that one of the reasons that it is over, despite what the more politically minded among them would say, is because the leaders of that organisation came into their 40s and 50s and decided that there was another life. They didn't want a life for their children such as the life that they'd had themselves. They wanted a more expansive human experience to be available, if only to the young. And in a sense, that coincides with the message of the Crying Game.
There will be some dissident Republicans who think that you can turn back the clock and replicate the tempo of the IRA campaign. That can't be done. Bulk of the IRA supports the peace process. Vast majority of former prisoners are in there working the political process. So I don't see any justification for return to armed struggle, and I'm glad to see it's over.